Craig Newmark back, the Craigslist guy. I particularly wanted to introduce this next panel discussion because we're talking about the startling and really disturbing trend of disinformation and to discuss the threat it really poses to our national security. And this is an area where I'm particularly passionate and particularly concerned. Americans have never had greater access to information, but it's gotten tougher and tougher to figure out when that information is trustworthy or if it just sounds trustworthy and smells trustworthy. What's worse, the insurrection on January 6th of last year showed how terrible the power of misinformation and its ability to galvanize the public can be. People were persuaded to make violent and destructive decisions, and that really hurt our country. The panel you're about to hear will discuss information warfare and its impact on our country and the state of our democracy. They'll talk about what leaders can do, whether they're in elected positions or advocates, as well as what the everyday citizen can do to curb the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Aspen Digital cybersecurity guy, Garrett Graff, is going to moderate a conversation between seriously esteemed cybersecurity and technology experts to unpack this big issue. Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Aspen Digital 92Y conversation at the State of Democracy Summit about information warfare and the threats of disinformation to our democracy. I'm joined by three super brilliant panelists. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative at Aspen Digital. And this is a problem and a challenge that our Aspen team has spent a lot of this last year thinking long and hard about as part of the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder. I'm joined today by two of that commission's commissioners, Yasmin Green and Will Hurd, as well as one of the commission's technical advisors, Alicia Wanless, for what I think will be a great conversation about the challenges that we face to our information ecosystem in the American democracy in 2022. Alicia, I want to start with you because you come at this as a geopolitical strategic thinker. Your work at the Carnegie Endowment sort of focuses on the really big geopolitical questions about countering information operations. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a landscape, sort of set the table stakes for us about why we are talking about this problem at a State of Democracy Summit. It feels like we have just seen this tidal wave of disinformation swamp our politics and our daily lives over the last couple of years, from the 2016 and 2020 elections to COVID vaccines to Pizzagate to QAnon. And while some of this feels organic, the outgrowth of the reach of social media platforms, a lot of this is actually stemming or being amplified by organized bad actors. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the goal of disinformation campaigns are for bad faith actors and how we have seen this problem evolve over the last couple of years.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Garrett. One of the big issues, I think, is that we tend to think this is extremely novel, and it's not. It's been around for a long time. Thucydides bemoaned the fact that they believed things about Sparta that they chose to believe that were inaccurate. This is something that has been perennially with us. Our bigger issue is that now that we've found this one kind of type of threat, we're hyper focused on it. We see it everywhere, but we don't really have a great baseline for understanding what was before, whether it actually has increased or not. And we don't really have a great way of looking at it holistically to understand how it's happening in context. And part of that issue is that we're looking at things very focused on threats and threat actors, as opposed to how they may be engaging with a wider ecosystem. the reason why it's problematic for democracies, I think it's become painfully apparent, particularly during the pandemic, is it affects public decision making. So politicians may be influenced by what's happening there. In most cases, politicians are also engaging with it. And that becomes even more challenging because people tend to believe people in a position of authority or people they think are like them. And so this makes disinformation coming from a politician that they respect perhaps even more salient and dangerous.
One of the things that, and you sort of started to touch on this, I think, is the extent to which we sometimes misunderstand what the goal of organized disinformation campaigns are. That it's not just about trying to convince people of an alternate truth or an alternate reality, it's in some ways trying to create permission structures for people to believe what they are already inclined to believe. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of the way that a bad actor might try to think strategically about the goals of disinformation.
Obviously, each actor is going to have their own aim for doing it. You could break them out into three broad categories. One is the type of actor that's seeking power. So they're a political actor, let's say, and they may be engaging in that in order to mobilize followers to support them. A second group tends to be the proselytizers. So these are people who may have bought into a certain ideology or belief, and they're engaging in it to try to get people to come along on their side as well. Sometimes the proselytizers and the politicians intersect, especially if there is mutual interest, and they can switch roles. All categories can be defined. I think the third area that's often underlooked are the people who are doing this for profit. And so they may not be directly invested in the ideas they're espousing. They're just doing it in order to make money. Sometimes, again, they align with and believe the things that proselytizers and politicians are pushing. What becomes really challenging is that all of these guys are trying to capture an audience among consumers who tend to be unwitting. But really the aim, especially in social media, is to get them to become participants in this. It's kind of a form of participatory propaganda where average users then grab onto an idea and start spreading it themselves, and this amplifies things. This is what makes it particularly challenging to really be able to study. And then add into that mix that you may have those actors deliberately doing things, but then you have a very robust traditional media ecosystem that's picking it up, amplifying it, and giving it more attention.
Yasmin, we're here today at this summit on the state of democracy, and one of the things that the Aspen Commission confronted and stated plainly in its final report is that disinformation is often a symptom but not the disease in democracy. That much of what we are seeing are foreign actors or bad faith actors exploiting existing seams and systemic inequalities around race, religion, class, ethnicity, and so forth. I wonder if you could sort of talk about how you see that challenge and where you see effectively sort of the benefit of disinformation accruing to the people who are trying to forward these campaigns.
Yeah, so I work at a group called Jigsaw, which is a part of Google semi-autonomous unit, and we actually have as our mission to defend open societies. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the role that the internet could play to promote healthy democracies, and then also that it's actually being played to undermine that goal. And 10 years ago when we started, we had very distinct focus areas like, tackling violent extremism or censorship, hate and harassment. And over time, it's become apparent that misinformation and disinformation just apply across all of them. So they really are not distinct lanes. They always come accompanied by one another. And in particular, over the last few years, the role of conspiracy theories, which I think is a distinct type of misinformation. I think it's helpful to distinguish it from just false and misleading beliefs. With conspiracy theories, we're really grappling with worldviews that are not just about what's happening, but also why it's happening. And those are really powerful because they become part of people's identities and ideologies, as Alicia said, and they can really be used to mobilize people towards action. So whether you're doing that, politically for political motivation or for profit, or to recruit and mobilize people towards violent extremist movements. So on one hand, we have the challenge that this is a human problem, not a tech problem, but we want to see if we can affect it with technology. There's no single definition for mis and disinformation, and we found in the commission in particular that depending on one's own lived experience and the constituency that they're representing, we tend to prioritize different manifestations of misinformation. So if you're from a repressive country, I'm from Iran, you think about the government actually using disinformation to censor, for example, independent media or opposition groups. If you're a social, racial justice activist, you think about the role of mis and disinformation in promoting white supremacy and kind of retarding the social justice movement. So that was a very interesting. It was really interesting, I suppose, for all of those different equities and priorities to come to the fore, with really only the takeaway that this is a phenomenon that's affecting every single societal challenge.
Mm-hmm. Will, you've had a variety of different windows into this challenge. First as a CIA officer, more recently serving on the U.S. House Intelligence Committee during the years where this problem really came to the fore. I wonder if you could talk about your own view of this challenge and how you think about the different actors in this space, their different goals, and how you've sort of seen your own thinking on this challenge evolve over the last couple of years as an elected official.
Sure, and I just want to foot stomp everything that my co-panelists have said. This is super interesting, even for me, who had a number of these conversations. But I look at this. It's the same problem, but there's two parts to it. There's a foreign piece, there's a domestic piece. And what complicates this is the people that are involved in understanding and countering these two pieces are different folks, right? And so the foreign piece is a little bit easier, in my opinion, because who's supposed to deal with that is very clear. It's our foreign policy apparatus, it's our intelligence services. I think the best example of good use is in CV, countering violent extremism, that Yasmin was talking about earlier. We know who those people are. We know the communities they're trying to target. We know the messages that they're using. We know the counter messaging that can be used to inoculate those communities from that payload, right? And so that's one thing. We also know who those people are. The Russians are and as Alicia had said, this is not new. The Russians have been perfecting the use of mis and disinformation for decades. Even when I was in the CIA and would come across a Russian intelligence officer, these old school spy versus spy, they would always want to use race and be like, does your government care about you because you're a Black officer? And it's like, bro, this isn't the 50s and the 60s, and so that stuff that you saw, I saw even back then. So, but what has changed, in my opinion, 2016, you had Russian groups creating and fomenting discord on social media, and then that was bleeding off into the real world, right? And I think in 2020 it changed in the domestic piece, where these are people with blue checks, right? These are our influencers that were propagating and promoting some of these lies, misinformation, and disinformation. And so when it comes to the domestic piece, the government's role and the federal government's role in this is a little bit trickier because the government shouldn't be telling people what to do. You have these platforms that should be providing terms of services and how they're being used. We know how these users are taking advantage of the platforms to propagate a message. And so it's a trickier issue to deal with. But again, to go back to Alicia's point, I started my first elected campaign in 2009. My biggest expense was mail, like physical mail in mailboxes. And if I were to keep track of all the mail that was sent in 2009 for campaigns, there'd be some crazy things that are said in mail, right? The difference was not everybody was seeing it, right? And I think that's what makes a social media and in the social media being used as a tool to propagate these messages.
Will, do you think that there's anything that we can do either as a country, as a political system, as a government to avoid normalizing disinformation as a political tool? I think what you're talking about is, there's sort of always been in American politics, this like one thread of, campaign dirty tricks. And, you can go back to, Lee Atwater and Willie Horton and, going back further and, sort of the campaign tactics that veer into misinformation and disinformation. But it seems like we're living through a different moment now where candidates are facing and amplifying, sometimes even themselves in their campaigns, lies that we know are actually lies. And I wonder if you think, as a campaign veteran, as an intelligence officer, is this something where this is now what normal American politics is going to be like, or is there something that we can do to change the arc of our political discussion at this point?
Look, on a real answer to that question, I defer to my colleagues on this panel. They have some better perspective on and smarter on these issues. But I would say this: look, in the short term, this we're going to continue to deal with this, right? And ultimately, the piece that is causing problem and decay within our society is the erosion of truth or the erosion of trust in all entities. That is local government, state government, federal government, in the press, in the scientific community. This erosion of trust, and nobody knows where to go to, and they latch on to other like-minded individuals and say, my idea has been supported. And once they do that, trying to change that individual's mind, I think is difficult. But again, so I think we're going to deal with this. However, I still believe that this is not the majority of the country. And so we always want to talk about the edge in political life, right? And that are doing similar things. That is not the edge of the left or the right is not a majority of the country. And so we focus too much on those edges when folks in the middle are more concerned about putting food on the table, a roof over their head, and taking care of the people that they love. And I think the way this changes is to have people running for elected office that talks to that group of people. It's hard because of the way our primary structures are, because that forces this conversation. Just for an example, in 2020, the 92% of congressional seats, House seats, were decided in the primary. That meant that there was an average of 54,000 people voted in each one of those in primary. So a very small, it's almost like 2% of the population are deciding who 92% of the people that are going into office. And guess what? Those are the most extremes. And so there's an opportunity because I don't think there's any one magic bullet. There's not one magic fix. It's going to require people that have the tenacity, that are willing to go out and say, hey, I'm going to be ideologically consistent, regardless of who's in office, whether it's someone wearing my jersey or not, and talk about things that people ultimately care about. And that's hard. And it's difficult. And the system is not set up for people like that, but it's doable.
Alicia and Yasmin, I want to come to you two next to talk a little bit about this issue that Will raised, which is the root of so much of this is this crisis of trust in the institutions that have long guided American life. Sort of the voices that we once trusted, our churches, our government, local media, have seen, decade after decade of falling trust. You each have sort of thought about this this challenge and this crisis, and I wonder if you, I'll start with Yasmin and then go to Alicia, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as strategies to try to rebuild trust in the public square.
Yeah, I firstly, Will for office. Secondly, I feel like this point about trust is so important, because if we're not deferring to those authorities, to those institutions, then there's a vacuum that can be filled by grifters or radicalizers who can produce information that speaks to us, to our grievances, to our prejudices. So that's definitely a driver, in my opinion. I would actually like to share, some of the stuff we're looking at that I think is promising in terms of countermeasures. Although just on the kind of vacuum of leadership point, I want to throw it over to you, Alicia, because your piece on the UN resolution that's been put forward on disinformation is definitely doing the rounds, and I think is really relevant here.
Well, that's nice to hear. Where to pick that up then? Because I think one big thing is that we really aren't looking strategically at this. We're very much in reaction phase. So we see a little bit of disinformation and then we completely freak out and say, oh, this is causing X, when we don't really know a lot about what it is actually causing. We had Princeton do a series of literature reviews for us on the academic reporting of the known effects of influence operations and the impact of interventions to influence operations. And the things we found was that we really don't know much about the effects of things like disinformation, particularly when it's occurring in a digital sphere. The second thing is we know even less about the impact of interventions. And the vast majority of academic literature that has been done to date is focused on things like fact-checking and disclosure, pre-bunking. Again, not the things that social media platforms are doing. So we don't exactly have a great understanding of what the phenomenon means beyond case studies and examples, which is fine. I think the other issue here is that we often, we feel that something has changed, but we don't really look at what those changes are. So the second thing there is, there are three major shifts that we need to be aware of. One is that information obviously travels faster and farther than it did before. The second thing is anybody can get involved. And so this is really giving rise to those minority voices who are often a lot louder online than they actually represent in the general population. That doesn't seem to matter, though, because it gets picked up by politicians because it works, and it gets picked up in media coverage, which has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of getting more people. My fear there is that it's going to polarize those people in the middle. And even if people do try to talk to that group in the middle, it's not going to get media attention because it's not sensationalist. So again, I come back to the system part. And then the third thing is the aggregation of data that is done by using social media at a time when we know more and more about human decision-making enables marketers to perhaps be more provocative and get, the attention that they need. Now, all of that being said, we don't know a whole lot. And yet every time there's a campaign, especially if it's foreign originating, we freak out, essentially. And at the same time, while we're kind of just dealing with the phenomenon, trying to come to a grasp of it, we've got Russia leading a bunch of authoritarian regimes with a resolution that passed in the UN in their framing of how this should be dealt with, calling on the Secretary General to take solicitations, ideas of best practices. We don't even understand the phenomenon. We don't even have a proposal to put forward. I'm thinking it's quite likely that countries like Russia already have their preferred solution, which is more control over the information environment. And so I'm left wondering, when it comes to their interests, are they doing these campaigns not so much to undermine democracy, but to push us into having our own form of digital sovereignty, which is what they've been campaigning for all along?
Yasmin, let me come back to you to pick up this question, of possible solutions. You've worked on online extremism in a variety of ways for a decade, if not longer, thinking hard about the recruitment and ideology and the intellectual corruption, for instance, of ISIS. What do you see working to bring people back to civic dialogue and participation, and how do you begin to try to deprogram people who have fallen hard for disinformation?
Well, I mean, at the time I felt, the challenge of the Islamic State, both kind of like the physical world conquest battlefield and taking territory that they called a state, and then the effect of this online marketing campaign that they were running at the time. It just felt so daunting and formidable. And 6 years on, I look back and I'm like, wow, that was a kind of solvable problem relative to what we have today, which is so diffuse and fragmented. And one of the things that was appealing about ISIS, well, there are three things. One is that it was a thing that we could talk about and agree on. People who were part of ISIS basically were card carrying. Secondly, it was a terrorist organization, so it was illegal. So it was clear what to do with the content that appeared online. And the third thing was that their claims ultimately were falsifiable because they had a caliphate that didn't manifest to be a Muslim utopia as they had promised. So once we had people who had gone to join and leave, formers who could speak about the experience and discredit the marketing, once we had like citizen journalism from Iraq and Syria that showed long, queues to get bread and people starving, hospitals that weren't working, you had a lot of natural kind of counter-narrative material that then we could help, which this was a program that we ran back in 2015-16 to use targeted advertising to match people who were showing sympathies to ISIS with some of this material that people had just organically uploaded. One of the transferable attributes, I think, of that campaign was elevating a little bit the attempt to push back to the level of narratives. So I think sometimes that, the prevalence and diversity of the false claims that are coming out for all these different reasons, political, profit, recreational, etc. Like it's just like a carpet bombing of, misinformation that cannot viably be addressed. It can't, fact checkers who are valuable for many reasons. They help a lot of the internet work better. That model cannot be scaled to the size of misinformation. But if we actually think instead about individual claims and at the level of narratives and tropes, then we have a much better chance. And actually reaching people before versus after they've been exposed. So more the pre-bunking versus debunking. There's a lot of research that shows that if you expose people to false claims and then tell them that they were wrong, it's much less effective than if you can tell people how they're going to be manipulated and then you show them the propaganda. Much more effective. For some reason, the reverse doesn't seem to work very well. Misinformation sticky, and if it has a first mover advantage, we're really in trouble. So the prescription then is identify the disinformation narratives that have legs and that have harms. So things that are going that endure, and get out ahead of them and reach people. So, for example, on vaccines, vaccine injury is a recurring health misinformation narrative. Like one person has a symptom, has some kind of symptom that may or may not be related to the vaccine, is not a reason for everybody to stop taking a vaccine, but that personal story has been used many times to undermine belief and faith in widespread vaccine adoption. But if we can understand that, for example, when there's a new drug that's available, often an initial study that says that something is effective is then overturned when the full body of evidence comes in. That's why there was all health professionals, I think, worth their salt, were not advocating for taking a lot of the experimental drugs early because they're just not approved and they're not safe. But if you wait until a highly influential politician or a head of state advocates for doing something that that is unfounded, and you want to then at that point challenge it, then you're bringing there are all these other challenges and a really high risk of blowback for people who have other reasons for believing that claim in that moment. So I think we have to kind of decide what we care about, and go out and do the work of helping build that resilience in people, especially in topics like health, elections, and racial justice related themes.
And Gary, I just want to add on to that. Look, the hard work of educating the population to be able to discern fact from fiction, right? Like this is this is really hard. Before the internet, when I was in school, and there were certain things you couldn't use, right? And it's like you better start with Funkin' Wagnall's encyclopedia with some of that piece of information before getting something out of the comic books, right? And so it's something that basic that we have to teach and talk about and recognize that opinion is different from fact, right? And to be able to discern between the two. And so that's something that goes across in different sides. And we also have to recognize that these problems that we're dealing with here are being used against us in other environments. The Russians are using this to erode trust of other NATO countries and us. The U.S. isn't going to be there. The Chinese government is doing this in the Pacific to say, hey, guess what, Taiwan? We're coming for you, and no one's going to have your back because of look at all these problems. So this issue is hurting us globally and hurting our position in the rest of the world.
Will, what do you wish the U.S. government was doing that it's not? If you end up getting appointed tomorrow, Joe Biden's disinformation czar, what would you be trying to drive change-wise in government?
Look, I think it starts with people, especially in the executive branch, being able to articulate, what the position is, right? When folks in a position of authority misstep, right, that has a huge impact. I think Dr. Fauci has done a great job for so long. I was still in Congress when COVID first happened, and from those initial engagements with Dr. Fauci, making sure we're educating and talking about the right things, right? That's a must within the government to push to reestablish some of that trust, right? And the only way you reestablish trust is it takes time, and people have to know that you're going to be honest. So look, I would look at how do we have competitive seats, more competitive seats, not less competitive seats, because it takes away the motivation in order to appeal to some of those edges. I would get Congress to start talking about future things. Look, how are we going to deal with conversation in a virtual world, right? If we, knowing some of the things that we know now about social media, would it looked at how we regulated social media differently? I would also tell the government to stop looking at new technologies if they're completely new, right? These are it's not new. Like, we have a lot of rules and regulations on the books. Let's make sure these new things, are able to follow those. So I think those are some of the examples. I wish I could say that there's one magic bullet that would solve this, and there isn't, right? It's improving education. Right. It's making sure you have infrastructure in some of these rural areas for folks to be able to have access to knowledge. But there's a long list. And I would look to my two co-panelists have some better ideas. But there isn't such thing as a silver bullet.
Yeah. And Alicia, I'd put the same question to you as we close out here. What do you wish the U.S. government was doing that you're not seeing it do right now?
There are so many things. First, I would say, I think we actually really need to be strategic, and we're not. And that means actually looking at the wider context, thinking where we want to go and what we want to do. That also involves having a good, frank conversation around what the lines in the sand are around what's acceptable and what isn't in terms of influence. And that's a very tricky discussion for democracies, because influence is actually part and parcel of getting other people to agree to do something with you. So the question is, where's the line in the sand where a person loses their agency and it affects the legitimacy of democracy because they can't make their own free and informed choices? To that end, I think there really needs to be a better education campaign to inform people what life in an internet age and information age really is. Nearly half the population graduated high school before the web was invented. They don't really understand how it works or how they can be targeted. This is a huge problem. Perhaps if they understood better, they may put more pressure on politicians to be better, right? We don't have great norms right now. And there are some good examples, like Lori Tron has published her own transparency reporting around her advertising spends on social media, which I think is great. And then beyond that, I think really we need some regulation around transparency reporting of tech companies to understand what data is there, how they're making decisions, and then some rules around data sharing so that we can actually move data into the hands of good researchers, and more funding to really understand the effects of things like influence operations, as well as the impact of countermeasures. And to sum all of that up, that really means we have to step back and stop looking at singular campaigns to the wider information environment to see if we can find conditions that would be precursors to major disturbances so we can act before something happens.
Alicia, Will, Yasmin, thank you so much for joining us here at the Summit on Democracy. It's a pleasure to talk with you all, and I hope that I will see you all in person again soon.
Cheers.
Thank you, Garrett.